January 1945. The frozen mud of Nancy, France, crunched under the boots of men who had long stopped counting the cost of each step. The air cut through their lungs like shards of glass, sharp and unyielding, a cruel companion to the bitter cold of -12 degrees Celsius. Inside the cramped walls of a field hospital, the scent of antiseptic barely masked the metallic tang of blood that had soaked every corner of the place. In one shadowed ward, a young lieutenant in a pristine uniform made a decision that would shake the foundations of authority and morality alike. He looked down at a black combat medic, hunched from 48 hours of saving lives in the snow, and issued a command that dripped with entitlement. "Get up, boy. This bed is for a real officer. Let the German sleep here." The words fell like stones on frozen ground, heavy and cruel. But before the medic could react, the heavy oak doors slammed open with a force that reverberated through the room. General George S. Patton entered, his presence an immediate storm. Ivory-handled pistols glinted at his hips, but it was the storm in his eyes that held the power to burn through the walls of arrogance and prejudice alike. He did not wait for a salute. He did not wait for explanations. He had come to witness a betrayal, not of protocol, but of honor, and he intended to punish it on the spot. The lieutenant, named Sterling, froze as the general's gaze fell upon him with lethal intensity. Patton had seen enough in the Third Army to understand that war was as much about character as it was about strategy. In early 1945, the gears of the American military were grinding under the weight of exported Jim Crow laws, a bitter inheritance from the South that had seeped into the very ranks of men fighting for freedom. Private Elijah Banks, the medic, was a man of the 366th Infantry, a unit nearly annihilated in the winter campaigns, whose medical detachments bore the invisible burden of heroism. These men worked in what soldiers grimly called the butcher's gallery, field hospitals where the smell of gangrene mixed with disinfectant, a scent that clung to the skin and lingered in the mind long after leaving. Banks had not slept on a proper bed for weeks. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, his hands coated with the lifeblood of men who back home would not have been allowed to sit beside him on a bus. Sterling, in contrast, embodied the toxic arrogance that Patton had spent years trying to eradicate. He had arrived at the front lines with spotless boots and a flawless sense of social entitlement. To him, the war was a hierarchy of class and race before it was a struggle against the Axis powers. When he gazed upon the captured German officer in the bed, a major of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Sterling did not see a man who had likely ordered the execution of Americans weeks prior. He saw a fellow officer, European, polished, deserving of comfort. In his mind, the medic on the floor was merely an inconvenient shadow, a reminder of the social hierarchy he believed was universal, even in the trenches of Europe. Patton's entrance changed everything. He did not speak at first, his eyes scanning the ward like a predator assessing prey. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic drip of ice melting from the hospital's warped roof. The tension was tangible, a physical weight pressing on every man present. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It was a low vibration that seemed to shake the very surgical instruments on the tables. "You standing there in that clean uniform, looking at this medic like he's dirt," Patton said, each word deliberate. "You've spent this war counting boxes of C rations while he's counted the last breaths of my infantrymen, and you think the enemy is your social peer." Sterling's face paled, not from fear of battle, but from the realization that the world he had relied on, rank, race, entitlement, was crumbling. Patton's method was surgical, psychological, and public. He would not allow this betrayal to remain a secret. He called the medical staff and every capable soldier to witness the consequences of moral failure. Then, with a precision that bordered on ritual, he walked to Sterling, reaching up to tear the silver bars from the young officer's shoulders. The sound of fabric ripping echoed like gunfire. His division patch followed, torn from the uniform in a deliberate display of symbolic destruction. "You are not fit to wear the symbols of a nation that fights for freedom," Patton growled, his voice rolling like artillery fire. Then, without hesitation, he turned to the SS officer. Any pretense of dignity vanished as Patton ordered 2 MPs to drag the German from the bed. The man fell onto the cold stone floor, his silk-lined uniform stained with mud and blood. "That is where the enemies of civilization sleep," Patton barked, cementing his point with authority and moral clarity. Finally, Patton addressed Banks. "This man," he said, gesturing to the now rankless Sterling, "is your primary orderly. He will eat only after every wounded man has been fed. He will sleep only after you sleep." and if he shows the slightest disrespect, contact my aide. I will have him sent to the front lines to see if his superiority holds up under real fire." This was more than a punishment. It was a complete inversion of power, a lesson that rank alone could not grant authority when moral courage was absent. Patton understood that Sterling's prejudice was a coward's tool, a way to claim dominance without facing the real enemy. By forcing him into service under the man he deemed inferior, Patton gave him a choice: earn respect through work and humility, or die in disgrace. Throughout that long, frozen day, the ward bore witness to a transformation. A man who had once considered himself untouchable scrubbed floors, carried stretchers, and cleaned blood from stone, all under the unwavering gaze of a medic who treated him not with malice, but with disciplined, professional detachment. For Patton, this was not social justice, it was strategy. He knew that internal divisions allowed to fester could destroy an army as surely as enemy fire. He had seen the heroism of the 761st Tank Battalion, the backbone of the Red Ball Express, and he knew that soldiers like Banks were indispensable. The Third Army could not afford prejudice to weaken its lethal edge. The War Department, however, would not have understood. The Pentagon feared the political consequences. Southern senators demanded strict segregation, and an incident like this, where a white officer was humbled by a black medic, could ignite a storm. Patton's aide, Colonel Codman, noted later that this event was quietly scrubbed from official logs. It was too raw, too real, too challenging to the status quo of 1945. Sterling endured 32 grueling days of this new life. He hauled stretchers through freezing mud, scrubbed the floors until his hands bled, and witnessed the quiet efficiency and dignity of a man he had once scorned. Slowly, arrogance gave way to understanding. By the time the Third Army launched its final push across the Rhine, Sterling's service record reflected humility, tireless effort, and a remarkable absence of the ego that had once defined him. Private Banks survived the European theater, returning to an America still steeped in systemic prejudice. Yet, the justice he had received from Patton remained a singular luminous moment. For the soldiers of the 761st and 366th, the story of the general and the medic's bed became combat folklore, a legend of moral courage, and an example of leadership that transcended race and rank. Patton, a man of contradictions, profane, demanding, flawed, showed in that cold morning in Nancy the essence of leadership stripped to its core. Honor is not a gift of birth, and rank is no shield against prejudice. He demonstrated that in the mud of battle, true equality is measured by courage, sacrifice, and humanity, and for those present in that ward, the lesson was indelible. The hours following Patton's intervention passed in a tense rhythm. The field hospital, normally a place where urgency blurred into chaos, became a theater of discipline and moral reckoning. Soldiers moved with a new awareness, their eyes tracing the figure of Sterling, now unadorned of rank, as he performed the most menial tasks under the exacting supervision of Private Banks. Each movement, each careful sweep of a mop across the blood-stained floors, was a lesson in humility writ large. What had once been a simple, cruel command from a man in authority was now a daily demonstration of how respect must be earned, not assumed. Sterling's transformation did not occur overnight. The first few days were the hardest. He struggled with the physical toll, the relentless lifting of stretchers, the scrubbing of gore-slicked floors, the long hours standing in freezing water that seeped through the thin soles of his boots. Each task was a confrontation with his own arrogance. Every grunt of effort, every ache in his shoulders reminded him that the hierarchy he had once relied upon was meaningless in the presence of true duty. Banks, for his part, remained a figure of quiet, unshakable authority. He did not speak unnecessarily, did not scold, and did not show vengeance. Yet his presence was commanding. His hands, skilled and unyielding, were a map of survival, etched with the scars and calluses of labor that Sterling could never have imagined. Other soldiers watched with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. Many had seen officers fail, crumble under the pressure of battle, or bow to the prejudices that poisoned the army's internal cohesion. But this public inversion of power was something entirely new. Men whispered in the corners of the wards, telling one another the story of how a general had personally intervened to strip an officer of his rank and place him under the command of a black medic. Some found humor in the irony, but most felt a reverent awe for Patton's audacity. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a fundamental truth. Courage and competence were the true currency of authority. In the nights that followed, Sterling's perception of Banks began to shift. No longer was the medic a symbol of racial hierarchy, an obstacle to be ignored or looked down upon. He became a living example of expertise, endurance, and quiet command. Banks moved through the ward with the same precision as a conductor leading an orchestra, every action purposeful, every decision calculated. Sterling observed, copied, and slowly internalized lessons that no classroom, no drill, and no textbook could teach. One evening, as snow continued to fall outside, and the wind howled against the hospital walls, Sterling found himself carrying a stretcher through the slippery mud outside the ward. A young private, barely 16, moaned beneath the canvas as the cold seeped into his bones. Sterling felt the weight not just physically but morally, a burden he could not dismiss with rank or authority. As he navigated the frozen terrain, he glanced at Banks, whose calm presence guided them both. It was in that moment that Sterling began to understand the depth of what he had once dismissed, that the measure of a man was not in the comfort he demanded, but in the lives he saved. Patton's influence was not limited to individual correction. The ripple effect spread across the hospital and beyond. Soldiers began to notice small but profound changes in the way orders were given, in the camaraderie that slowly emerged from the chaos. Tasks were no longer about demonstrating superiority. They became about mutual survival and respect. Men of different races who had once avoided each other began sharing duties with an understanding born of necessity and reinforced by observation. The unspoken lesson was clear. In the crucible of war, every hand that labored mattered equally, every life carried the same weight, and every act of courage, regardless of the soldier's background, deserved recognition. It was during one particularly brutal night that Sterling's final lesson arrived. A transport truck carrying wounded soldiers arrived unexpectedly, the wounded spilling out onto the snow with cries that pierced the icy air. Sterling, alongside Banks, coordinated the reception, triage, and care. The work was relentless. Bandages needed changing, splints had to be applied, and frostbitten extremities demanded immediate attention. The sheer volume threatened to overwhelm them, but Sterling now moved with an efficiency and composure he had never possessed. Every command from Banks was executed without hesitation, every decision made with the awareness that hesitation could mean death. In those moments, Sterling's old arrogance clashed with the stark reality of mortality. For the first time, he confronted the fragility of life and the triviality of social prejudice. His perspective expanded. He realized that the war was not a stage for his social superiority, but a shared trial where survival, courage, and integrity were the only markers of distinction. He learned to anticipate the needs of the wounded, to act before being told, and to value collaboration over hierarchy. It was a hard-earned education, far more impactful than any promotion or medal could ever provide. Banks, ever vigilant, noticed the change but offered no praise. He allowed Sterling to struggle when necessary, to fail in minor tasks, and to discover the consequences of carelessness. It was mentorship through experience, a method both cruel and fair. Sterling came to understand that respect was not commanded. It was earned through persistent action, humility, and genuine commitment to the lives entrusted to one's care. Outside the hospital, the battle raged on. The Third Army pressed forward, crossing frozen rivers and battling entrenched enemy positions. Reports of Sterling's transformation began to circulate quietly among senior officers. His work ethic, humility, and dedication became noted in unofficial records and whispered accounts. Soldiers began to treat him differently, not because of his rank, which had been restored by Patton at a later stage, but because of the respect he had genuinely earned. The winter of 1945, brutal and unrelenting, became the backdrop to a profound story of transformation. Each frozen step across the mud of Nancy, each shivering moment inside the bloodied hospital ward, each life touched by Banks and Sterling's efforts, reinforced a lesson that resonated far beyond that small corner of France. In the crucible of human struggle, character is forged in action, not inherited by birth. Patton's intervention, though controversial and largely unrecorded in official logs, left a lasting imprint on the soldiers who witnessed it. For many, it was proof that leadership required moral courage, not just strategic brilliance. The story spread quietly through the ranks, gaining almost mythic significance among those who understood the subtle but powerful lesson. Authority without empathy and justice was hollow. True leadership demanded the courage to confront prejudice wherever it appeared, even within one's own ranks. As the days turned to weeks, Sterling continued his service with an awareness he had never possessed. Every task became an opportunity to act rightly, every decision a test of his newfound humility. He learned to measure his strength not by the obedience he commanded, but by the lives he protected and the dignity he preserved in others. Banks, patient and unwavering, became both mentor and mirror, reflecting the principles of courage, integrity, and quiet authority that Sterling had once scorned. By the time the Third Army began its final push across the Rhine, the transformation was complete. Sterling had shed his former arrogance, embraced service over privilege, and internalized lessons that would guide him long after the war ended. For Banks, the moment was quietly affirming, a recognition that competence, courage, and moral clarity could overcome entrenched prejudice, and that even the most arrogant could be reshaped through discipline, mentorship, and unflinching justice. The final weeks of the European campaign were a test of endurance, character, and moral resolve. Sterling, now tempered by his time under Private Banks, moved through the chaos of the Third Army with a focus previously unimaginable. Each day brought new challenges: wounded soldiers from the front lines, supply shortages, frozen rivers to cross, and enemy counterattacks that left no room for hesitation. The lessons learned in the hospital ward became his guiding principles. He had seen firsthand that survival depended not on rank, but on courage, competence, and the willingness to act with integrity under pressure. The transformation was not just physical or procedural, it was profoundly internal. Sterling's understanding of humanity expanded beyond the rigid social hierarchies he had once embraced. He now saw every soldier as an individual with intrinsic worth, each contribution vital to the survival of the unit. The lines between officer and enlisted, between white and black, blurred into irrelevance when measured against the immediacy of life and death. The young lieutenant who had once assumed entitlement now recognized the true cost of leadership: accountability, empathy, and tireless service. In one particularly harrowing episode, Sterling found himself assisting in the evacuation of an artillery unit trapped behind enemy lines. Snow fell in thick sheets, visibility dropped to mere yards, and the ground itself seemed determined to swallow men whole. Sterling, alongside a team of medics including Banks, carried wounded soldiers over ice-crusted embankments, stabilized those with severe injuries, and improvised stretchers from the remnants of broken equipment. Each action was precise, each decision critical. The young private who had once been a symbol of human weakness now embodied the quiet heroism that Patton had insisted was the true measure of a soldier. Even the German prisoners of war could not escape the lessons of this transformed environment. Sterling, acting under Banks's guidance, administered care with impartiality and efficiency. The irony was not lost on those who observed. The man who had once prioritized enemy comfort over his own comrades now treated every life with equal consideration. The walls of the field hospital had become a crucible in which prejudice was stripped away, leaving only competency, compassion, and respect as the pillars of authority. Patton's influence persisted, even when he was not present. Soldiers spoke of his presence as if it were a force field, a standard of accountability that transcended immediate command. The story of the medic's bed spread quietly but widely, a legend among men who understood the weight of moral courage in the theater of war. It was more than anecdote, it was doctrine lived in practice. Leadership, they learned, demanded the courage to act against injustice, the discipline to maintain fairness, and the humility to acknowledge when one's assumptions were wrong. As the Third Army pressed forward toward the Rhine, Sterling's transformation became evident to every officer and soldier who encountered him. He no longer relied on entitlement or social standing. His authority stemmed from skill, empathy, and unwavering commitment to duty. Soldiers sought his guidance, respected his judgment, and trusted in his decisions. Banks, observing this evolution, allowed Sterling to step into responsibilities with increasing independence, confident that the lessons had taken root. The mentor-student dynamic had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect, a rare and fragile bond forged in blood, mud, and fire. The culminating moment came during the final assault on a heavily fortified German position near the Rhine. Sterling led a team of medics through artillery fire, retrieving the wounded, stabilizing them under intense pressure, and ensuring evacuation to field hospitals. Every decision, every movement reflected the values instilled during those first grueling weeks under Banks's guidance. The men he once commanded through arrogance now followed him out of respect earned through action, not birthright. When the battle ended, casualties accounted for and survivors evacuated, the field hospital became a sanctuary not just of healing, but of hard-won understanding and mutual recognition. When the war finally drew to a close in Europe, Sterling returned home a changed man. The accolades he received were modest. Medals and commendations were less important than the internal transformation he had undergone. He carried with him the memory of Private Banks, a man whose quiet authority had dismantled arrogance and prejudice in the most profound and practical way imaginable. Sterling's life after the war was dedicated to service in a broader sense, mentoring others, advocating for fairness, and ensuring that the lessons he had learned were passed on to the next generation of soldiers. Private Banks, for his part, returned to a society still rife with systemic prejudice. Yet the memory of Patton's intervention, of the recognition of his courage and skill, remained a defining moment. It became a symbol of what was possible when leadership confronted injustice directly, when moral courage was recognized, and when the true measure of a soldier was his actions under pressure, not the color of his skin. The story of the "no color in the mud" incident lived quietly in the memory of those who had been present. It was a legend whispered in the mess halls, recounted in hushed tones in tents, and passed along to new soldiers with reverence. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Honor and courage are universal. Rank, privilege, and prejudice are transient. They are meaningless in the face of action, sacrifice, and integrity. The war had stripped away illusions, leaving clarity in its place. For George S. Patton, that single winter morning in Nancy represented the essence of leadership. His actions were not political, nor were they motivated by a desire for social reform. They were calculated, precise, and moral in their clarity. Patton understood that an army divided by prejudice could never achieve its full potential. He recognized that the lifeblood of combat effectiveness flowed through men like Banks, and that true authority derived not from rank, but from competence, courage, and fairness. In stripping Sterling of his rank, forcing him to serve under a man he once scorned, Patton had done more than punish a single officer. He had demonstrated the power of accountability, empathy, and moral clarity to an entire army. In reflecting on this incident today, we see lessons that extend far beyond the battlefield. Leadership, true leadership, requires the courage to confront wrongdoing within one's own ranks, the discipline to maintain fairness in the face of pressure, and the humility to recognize the inherent value in every individual. Sterling's transformation, Banks' steadfastness, and Patton's decisive intervention together illustrate that moral courage is the foundation upon which effective action is built. The Third Army's advance into Germany, marked by courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to duty, was shaped not just by strategy and firepower, but by these moments of clarity and justice. Each soldier who witnessed Sterling's humbling and subsequent growth carried the lesson forward, that integrity cannot be commanded by rank alone, that respect must be earned through action, and that prejudice has no place in an army committed to victory. Even decades later, veterans recount the story with a mixture of awe and reverence. The memory of a general confronting prejudice, of a medic exercising quiet authority, and of a former officer learning humility under fire, became a narrative emblematic of the values that endure in the human spirit. The frozen mud of Nancy, once a place of suffering and death, transformed into a crucible of moral and personal growth. As we look back, the "no color in the mud" incident reminds us that the measures of character are revealed not in ease, but in adversity. It demonstrates that the principles of justice, courage, and respect are timeless. Patton, Sterling, and Banks together crafted a lesson for all time. That in moments of extreme pressure, moral clarity can define not just a career, but the legacy of an army and the conscience of a nation. In the end, what happened in Nancy was more than history. It was a testament to human potential, to the capacity for transformation, and to the enduring power of leadership grounded in justice. Sterling emerged humbled yet wiser, Banks remained steadfast and honored, and Patton's decisive intervention ensured that the American Army, even in its most difficult moments, could uphold the ideals it claimed to defend. The lesson is clear: courage and honor are universal, and the measure of a man or an army is found in the choices made when all else is stripped away. The frozen wards, the mud-filled streets, the exhausted men, they all bear witness to a truth as enduring as history itself. In the fire of conflict, the essence of humanity is revealed, and in that revelation, the capacity for justice, humility, and courage shines brightest.